The workshop wasn't just silent, it was dead. With the nullification broadcast in full effect, the complex symphony of humming servers, blinking status lights, and the persistent, low-frequency digital vibration that had plagued the low sector for centuries was completely gone. In its place, there was only the sharp, agonizing sound of Mara's heavy, panicked breathing and the distant, rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the mud-slicked pavement outside. Silas stood frozen, his eyes glued to the flickering monitor that showed the feed from the workshop's external perimeter cameras. The three Seraphim Guard units moved with a terrifying, predator-like precision. They didn't run, they surged, their porcelain-white armor plates reflecting the dim, flickering emergency lights of the alleyway. The lead unit, the one with the jagged, crown-like sensor array protruding from its helmet, raised a sleek, high-frequency plasma lance that glowed with a terrifying intensity. "They're bypassing the secondary locks," Mara whispered, her voice trembling as she frantically keyed commands into a terminal that was rapidly melting from the internal heat of the broadcast overload. "My automated defense grid is offline. The broadcast pulled all the power from the security nodes. We are completely exposed, Sealers." "How long until the reboot cycle kicks in?" Sealers asked, his voice steadying despite the adrenaline hammering against his ribs. He looked around the room, his eyes cataloging every piece of junk, every discarded circuit, and every scrap of metal that could be turned into a weapon. "The feedback loop is catastrophic," Mara replied, her fingers flying across the console with desperate speed. "The entire workshop is going to dump its core charge in 60 seconds. If they get inside before that, we won't just be killed, we'll be vaporized." Sealers didn't waste another second. He grabbed a heavy, discarded industrial wrench from a nearby workbench and began tearing apart the copper cabling that hung from the ceiling. "We need to create a choke point. Mara, redirect all the remaining power from the workshop's emergency batteries into the blast door frame. If we can't lock it, we can at least turn the frame into an active electrical hazard." "That'll drain the last of my power," Mara shouted, but she was already moving, dragging a heavy power cable across the floor to wire it directly into the door's locking mechanism. The blast door groaned as the Seraphim Guard began their assault. It wasn't the sound of a normal break-in, it was the sound of concentrated plasma cutting through inches of reinforced industrial steel. A jagged, glowing orange line appeared in the center of the door, and the smell of molten metal filled the room. Outside, the first Seraphim Guard didn't even pause. It slammed its lance against the door, the impact sending a shockwave through the workshop that sent tools flying off the workbenches. 40 seconds, Mara yelled, her face pale as she watched the door buckle. Sealers stood behind the main workbench, his wrench gripped tightly in his hands. He knew he was outmatched. These were the elite hunters of the Celestial Order, the very entities that had kept the vampire in hiding for centuries. But as he looked at the dark, silent alleys outside through the observation window, he felt a strange, cold clarity. The broadcast hadn't just shut down the machines, it had broken the spell. For the first time, he could see the Seraphim Guard not as gods, but as machines, flawed, predictable, and ultimately fragile. "They're coming through." With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the blast door was ripped off its hinges. The first Seraphim Guard stepped into the workshop, its synthetic yellow visor scanning the room with ruthless efficiency. Its plasma lance hummed with enough energy to melt stone, and it didn't hesitate to target the console where Mara was still working. But it never reached her. From the shadows above the entrance, a dark blur of motion descended like a falling star. The vampire hit the Seraphim Guard with the force of a wrecking ball, the sheer weight of his momentum driving the construct into the concrete floor with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The Eclipse blade appeared in the vampire's hand, a jagged shard of midnight black glass that seemed to pull the very light out of the room. The combat was vicious and blindingly fast. The two remaining guards inside the room leveled their lances, their visors flashing in a rapid, synchronized rhythm. They didn't just fight, they computed. They fired a dual-frequency suppression field, a blinding white light meant to paralyze the vampire's central nervous system. But the vampire was ready. He didn't shy away from the light. He leaned into it, his own crimson eyes flaring with an inner intensity that rivaled the Seraphim's own power. He raised the Eclipse blade, and the crimson artery running down its center pulsed, acting as a lightning rod. The white light of the suppression field was sucked into the blade, the massive sword growing brighter and more volatile with every passing second. "Sealers, now!" the vampire roared, his voice echoing with an authority that seemed to vibrate the very air of the room. Sealers didn't hesitate. He swung the copper cabling he had been rigging toward the door frame, catching the second guard in the chest with a live 2,000-volt charge. The construct seized, its internal servos shrieking as its stabilization processes were fried in an instant. It collapsed into a heap of twitching porcelain and sparks. The final Seraphim guard, sensing the total failure of its tactical parameters, turned to target Sealers, its lance charging for a lethal blast. But the vampire was already moving. He pivoted, bringing the Eclipse blade around in a wide, whistling arc. The blade didn't just cut, it severed. The black glass passed through the guard's plasma lance, the energy weapon shattering into a cloud of ionizing gas before continuing through the creature's neck. The Seraphim guard froze. For a single, terrifying second, it remained upright. Then, its head slid cleanly off its shoulders, and it collapsed into a pile of lifeless metal. The workshop fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. The vampire stood amidst the wreckage, his cloak tattered and his chest heaving, the Eclipse blade slowly fading back to its dull, obsidian color. He turned his gaze toward Mara, then to Sealers, his crimson eyes reflecting the soft, flickering light of the dying computers. "The broadcast is failing," the vampire said, his voice quiet, almost exhausted. "The system is initiating its reboot. We have minutes before the entire grid comes back online, and when it does, it will know exactly where we are." Mara looked at her console, her hands shaking as she pulled a small, silver data spike from the main terminal. "I've got the primary routing data. I managed to mirror the network's internal handshake. We can use this to spoof our signatures, but only for a short time." "It's enough," the vampire replied, sheathing the Eclipse blade beneath his cloak. "We have the key, we have the map, and now we have the first wave of the resistance." He walked over to the blast door, looking out into the silent, dark alleyway. Thousands of residents of the Seventh Circle were starting to move again. They were no longer wandering like mindless ghosts. They were standing still, looking at each other, their faces filled with a mixture of terror, confusion, and a sudden, burning realization of their own humanity. They were waking up. "Look at them," Sealers said, stepping up beside the vampire. "They're realizing the silence isn't a threat, it's a choice." "They are realizing that the gods are silent," the vampire corrected, "and that is the most dangerous realization a slave can ever have." He turned to Sealers, his gaze intense. "We cannot stay here. The enforcers will be here in force within the hour. We need to move into the deep tunnels beneath the Seventh Circle. There are factions down there, groups that the network couldn't fully integrate because of the interference from the old Tartarian foundations. They are the only ones with the tactical depth to fight an open war." "The Shadow Walkers," Mara added, appearing beside them, her prosthetic arm humming as it powered down. "I can lead you to their primary relay. They've been waiting for a reason to strike for decades, but they won't follow you just because you have an ancient sword, sire. They only respect results." "They will see the results," the vampire promised, his crimson eyes glancing up toward the dark, unseen ceiling where the upper spires sat like a crown of thorns. "We are going to strike the second distribution node in the western sector. If we take that, we don't just black out the slums. We bring the entire mid-sector grid to its knees." "That's a suicide mission," Sealers said, though he was already checking the charge on his own hidden tools. "Every mission is suicide when you are fighting an empire," the vampire replied, stepping out into the dark alleyway. "But tonight, for the first time in history, the Empire is afraid of us." As they moved out into the silent, waking slums, the city around them began to stir. It wasn't the rhythmic, artificial pulse of the corporate machines. It was the messy, chaotic, and defiant sound of humanity finally breathing on its own. They trekked through the labyrinth of the low sector, the vampire leading the way with an unerring sense of direction that bypassed every major patrol route. Sealers kept pace, his mind constantly racing to process the new reality. He had been a scavenger, a boy who lived in the scraps of other people's power, but he felt different now. The silence in his head, the absence of the constant network ping, made him feel lighter, faster, and more aware of his own agency than he had ever been. They reached the perimeter of the Western Transit District, a sprawling industrial complex where the geothermal lines were most concentrated. Towering pipelines snaked through the air like the rusted ribs of a leviathan, venting clouds of high-pressure steam that obscured the view of the upper spires. "This is it," Mara whispered, pointing toward a massive, bunker-like structure nestled between two of the primary pipelines. "The western node. It's heavily fortified, but the heat signatures are coming from the internal cooling vents. If we can trigger a chain reaction, the explosion will be contained within the pipe network, but the power draw will be massive enough to force an emergency lockdown of the entire sector grid." The vampire nodded, his presence suddenly shifting. He didn't just walk, he became part of the shadows, his form blurring as he moved toward the bunker's exterior wall. "Sealers, Mara, you handle the security array, I will provide the distraction." He didn't wait for a reply, he sprinted toward the entrance, his speed defying human physics. He didn't use the shadows, he walked straight into the light of the guard towers. The response was immediate. Searchlights blazed, and a dozen automated sentry turrets mounted on the bunker walls swung toward him, their barrels glowing with the heat of charging energy rounds. "Now," the vampire yelled, his voice echoing across the district. He didn't draw his sword. Instead, he slammed his hands into the concrete wall of the bunker, his crimson eyes flaring with a raw, primal energy. A shockwave of pure force erupted from his palms, shattering the bunker's concrete exterior and sending massive chunks of rock flying into the sentry turrets. The turrets exploded in a shower of sparks, their automated targeting systems failing as they lost their structural foundation. "Go, go, go," Sealers screamed, leading Mara through the opening the vampire had created. The inside of the bunker was a mess of pressurized valves, high-voltage conduits, and emergency shut-off switches. Mara dived toward the main control console, her prosthetic arm locking into the interface with a series of aggressive, metallic clicks. "I'm in," she shouted, her fingers dancing across the keys. "I'm rerouting the geothermal load, but the system is fighting back. It's trying to purge the excess energy into the cooling tanks." "Don't let it," Sealers commanded, bracing himself against the control board as the entire structure began to vibrate under the strain. He pulled out a series of bypass cables, manually linking the emergency release valves directly to the main transmission line. "If we dump the pressure directly into the transmission line, the entire sector will be forced into a reset." Outside, the sounds of battle were escalating. The vampire was a whirlwind of movement, his movements too fast for the incoming enforcer squads to track. He was dismantling their heavy armor with his bare hands, his strength augmented by the same dark energy that pulsed through the Eclipse blade. "Power levels are critical," Mara yelled, her voice straining over the roar of the machinery. "The node is going to blow in 10 seconds. "Get out of here," the vampire roared, his voice cutting through the thick smoke of the battle. Sealers grabbed Mara, pulling her toward the back exit just as the bunker's main containment dome began to warp under the pressure. The entire structure glowed with a blinding, white light as the geothermal load reached its breaking point. They dived through the back exit, rolling across the muddy ground as the bunker behind them erupted in a massive, thunderous explosion. A pillar of fire and steam shot hundreds of feet into the air, lighting up the low sector like a miniature sun. Sealers scrambled to his feet, watching as the shockwave rolled across the city. The entire western sector's lights flickered and died. And the massive transmission towers that loomed over the skyline went dark, one by one. The silence that followed was total. The vampire appeared beside them, his clothes singed, his face covered in soot, but his eyes were shining with a triumphant, dangerous light. He looked up at the darkened spires, his grip tightening on the hilt of his concealed blade. "They are blind again," he said, his voice a soft, final promise. But this time they know we are coming. Silas stood tall, the cold wind of the slums biting into his skin, but he didn't shiver. He finally understood the weight of his own existence. He wasn't just a scavenger anymore. He was a spark in a world that had forgotten how to burn. "What's next?" Silas asked, looking at the vampire. The vampire stared toward the heart of the upper spires, where the sanctum of the first core awaited. "Next, we stop playing in the dark. Next, we force them to look us in the eye." As they stood in the ruins of the node, the first sounds of the city's waking defiance began to rise. From the depths of the shanties, from the abandoned factories, and from the forgotten alleyways, the voices of 1,000 people began to echo, not as slaves, but as an army. They were calling out to one another, their voices forming a low, rhythmic chant that signaled the end of the corporate era. The silence was over, the storm was coming. And for the first time in centuries, the last king was not fighting alone.